Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a thought so clear it feels like someone whispered it directly into your soul? That moment, when the chaos of the day has finally settled, and in the still darkness, a truth emerges that you somehow missed in the noise of your waking hours. We live in a world that rarely stops talking, where silence has become something we actively avoid rather than seek. Our phones buzz constantly, our televisions flicker through the night, and even in moments of physical quiet, our minds race with endless to-do lists and worries. But what if in our desperate attempts to fill every moment with sound and distraction, we're drowning out the most important voice of all? What if God speaks most clearly not in the thunderous moments of obvious revelation, but in the gentle whisper that can only be heard when everything else goes quiet? Saint Ignatius of Loyola, that wounded soldier who became one of the Church's greatest spiritual masters, discovered a profound truth that many of us have forgotten. The silent heart is where God speaks the loudest, even during sleep. Consider your own experience for a moment. How many times have you struggled with a decision, analyzed it from every angle, consulted friends and experts, only to wake up one morning with a clarity that seemed to arrive while you slept? This isn't coincidence. When we allow ourselves to enter into true silence, when the conscious mind finally releases its grip on our thoughts, something remarkable happens. The voice that has been trying to reach us all along finally has space to be heard. This is exactly what Ignatius discovered during those long months of recovery after a cannonball shattered his leg at Pamplona. Confined to his bed with nothing but religious texts to read, he began to notice something curious about his interior life. When he fantasized about returning to his old life of courtly adventures and romantic conquests, he initially felt excitement, but afterward, a profound emptiness followed. Yet when he contemplated serving God as the saints had done, though the thoughts seemed more challenging, they left him with a lasting peace and contentment that endured long after the daydreams ended. This recognition became the foundation of what we now call Ignatian discernment, that remarkable gift of spiritual insight that helps us distinguish between the voices competing for attention in our hearts. You see, Ignatius understood something essential about how God communicates with us. Unlike the demanding shouts of our culture that insist on immediate attention, God's voice often comes as what Scripture calls a still, small voice, one that requires intention and quiet to perceive. The noise of our daily lives can easily drown out this divine whisper, and nowhere do we find a more natural silence than in sleep, when our defenses are lowered and our souls are most receptive. This understanding wasn't just theoretical for Ignatius. Throughout his spiritual autobiography, he records numerous instances where crucial insights came to him during or immediately after sleep. After his conversion, while spending nearly a year in prayer and penance in the small town of Manresa, he would often wake with spiritual understandings that he couldn't have arrived at through conscious reasoning alone. These nighttime revelations became so significant that he incorporated them into his spiritual exercises, that masterpiece of spiritual direction that has guided countless souls toward deeper communion with God for nearly 5 centuries. But what makes Ignatius's understanding of sleep and silence so revolutionary, even in our modern context? It's that he recognized these quiet spaces not just as absence, not as mere gaps between important moments, but as the very occasions where God most profoundly works in our souls. In today's language, we might say that Ignatius understood that our subconscious mind, free from the constraints of our ego and rational defenses, can perceive spiritual truths our waking mind might reject. When he counseled retreatants to review their prayer before sleeping, and to notice the first thoughts upon waking, he wasn't just offering a practical meditation technique. He was acknowledging that God continues to work in us, even when we're not consciously aware of it. Think about how different this is from our usual approach to problem-solving or decision-making. We typically believe that more information, more analysis, and more conscious thought will lead to better outcomes. We stay up late making pros and cons lists. We research endlessly online. We consult expert after expert, and often, we end up more confused than when we started. Ignatius offers us a counterintuitive alternative. Sometimes the best thing we can do with a difficult question is to hold it gently in prayer, then let it go as we drift into sleep, trusting that our deeper mind, guided by the Holy Spirit, will continue to work while we rest. The brilliant insight of Ignatius was recognizing that God communicates with us not just through our rational mind, but through every dimension of our being. Our emotions, our imagination, our intuition, and yes, even our dreams, and the twilight thoughts that come in the margins of sleep, can all be channels for divine guidance. God, who created every aspect of our humanity, works through all of it, not just our conscious reasoning. This holistic understanding of spiritual communication was revolutionary in a time when religious experience was often confined to formal prayer and ritual. And it remains profound today, when we still tend to separate our spiritual lives from our emotional and physical existence. I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you ever experienced a moment of clarity or peace that came to you in the quiet hours before dawn or upon first waking? That sense that something has been resolved in your heart while you slept. If this resonates with you, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "God speaks in my silence too." And if you feel comfortable, briefly tell us about your experience. Your story could be precisely what someone else needs to read today to recognize those quiet moments in their own life when God has been speaking. Sometimes, acknowledging these experiences is the first step toward becoming more attentive to them. The transformative power of Ignatius's approach becomes clear when we look at his own life journey. Before his conversion, Ignatius was what we might today call an adrenaline junkie. He sought excitement and validation through military exploits, courtly intrigues, and romantic pursuits. His life was filled with noise, action, and constant stimulation. There was little room for silence or self-reflection. Even his early religious fervor after his conversion carried this same intensity, as he threw himself into extreme ascetic practices and ambitious plans to travel to Jerusalem. It was only during his extended time in Manresa, where circumstances forced him into a period of quiet and solitude, that he began to develop a more balanced and profound spiritual life. Here, in the silence of a small Spanish town, away from the battlefield and the royal court, he learned to listen to the subtle movements of God in his heart. He discovered that authentic spiritual growth wasn't about dramatic gestures or heroic feats of penance, but about paying attention to the quiet voice of God, speaking in everyday moments, in prayer, in nature, and especially in the silence of early morning or late evening. This transformation wasn't easy or immediate. Ignatius went through periods of severe spiritual desolation in Manresa, including a time when he was so tormented by scruples and religious anxiety that he contemplated suicide. He tried to overcome these struggles through sheer willpower and ever more extreme penances, but found no relief. The breakthrough came not through increased effort, but through surrender. After an especially difficult night, he woke with a clear sense that God had liberated him from his scruples, not because of anything he had done, but through pure grace operating in his sleep. This experience shaped Ignatius's understanding of how God works in our lives. He realized that spiritual growth isn't primarily about our own efforts, though those have their place, but about creating space for God to work in us. Sometimes that space is created precisely when we stop trying so hard, when we allow ourselves to rest in God's presence without agenda or expectation. Sleep, in this context, becomes not just physical necessity, but spiritual opportunity, a time when we release control and allow God to work in the depths of our being. The spiritual exercises that Ignatius developed incorporate this understanding in multiple ways. When guiding someone through this intensive spiritual program, whether in the original 30-day retreat format or in the adaptation for daily life, Ignatius consistently emphasizes the importance of the transitions into and out of sleep. He advises retreatants to briefly review their prayer material for the next day just before sleeping, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of inviting God to work with these themes in the mysterious realm of sleep and dream. Then, upon waking, before the mind becomes cluttered with the concerns of the day, he encourages careful attention to whatever feelings, insights, or movements are present. This approach recognizes that spiritual growth doesn't happen in a linear or purely conscious way. It occurs in the integration of our conscious awareness with the deeper movements of our psyche and spirit, many of which happen below the threshold of our normal awareness. By honoring the significance of sleep and the twilight states between waking and sleeping, Ignatius gives us permission to trust these natural rhythms as part of our spiritual journey, rather than seeing them as interruptions to our real spiritual work. What's particularly beautiful about this aspect of Ignatian spirituality is how it honors the body as part of our spiritual life. Unlike some spiritual traditions that seek to transcend or even reject bodily experience, Ignatius recognized that our physical nature is integral to how we encounter God. Sleep isn't just a biological necessity, it's a spiritual practice, a time of particular openness to God's work in us. Our need for rest isn't a limitation to overcome, but a divinely created rhythm that creates space for a different kind of communion with God than we experience in our active hours. This integration of body and spirit reflects the incarnational heart of Christian faith. The God who took on flesh in Jesus continues to meet us in our embodied humanity, not despite it. When we honor sleep as spiritually significant, we acknowledge that our entire created nature, not just our conscious mind, is designed for relationship with God. We recognize that the division between sacred and mundane, spiritual and physical, is an artificial one that doesn't reflect the wholeness of our created being, or God's desire to be present in every aspect of our lives. The famous Ignatian practice of the exam, a prayerful review of the day typically done in the evening, connects deeply with this understanding of sleep's spiritual significance. Ignatius recommended this practice as a daily discipline, ideally done before sleep. In the exam, we review the events, feelings, and choices of our day in God's presence, noticing moments of both connection and distance from God. We express gratitude, ask for insight, and seek forgiveness where needed. Then, having entrusted the day and all its contents to God's mercy, we can release our conscious hold on these matters as we drift into sleep. Many who practice the examen regularly report that they often wake with new perspectives or clarity about situations they reviewed the night before. A problem that seemed insurmountable appears more manageable in the morning light. A relationship conflict suddenly reveals a possible path to reconciliation. A decision that felt impossibly complex now has a clear direction. Again, we see this pattern of God working in our silence and rest, continuing the conversation even when our conscious mind is offline. The exam creates a bridge between our active, waking discernment and the deeper work that happens in silence and sleep. Modern neuroscience offers fascinating confirmation of what Ignatius intuited centuries ago. Research on sleep and dreaming reveals that our brains are far from inactive during rest. Rather, they engage in essential processes of memory consolidation, emotional processing, and problem-solving while we sleep. The breakthrough insights or emotional resolutions that seem to arrive with the morning light have genuine neurological underpinnings. What Ignatius described in spiritual terms as God speaking to us during sleep aligns remarkably well with what science now reveals about how our brains continue to work below the level of consciousness. This convergence of spiritual wisdom and scientific understanding doesn't diminish the sacred nature of these experiences. Rather, it suggests that God works through the natural processes of our created minds, just as divine grace typically works through natural events rather than against them. The God who designed our brains to process and integrate during sleep also uses this design as a channel for spiritual guidance. As with many aspects of faith, science doesn't compete with spiritual understanding here, but offers complementary insight into how God's communication might operate through the gift of our created nature. What's also striking about Ignatius's approach to silence and sleep is how countercultural it feels, both in his time and in ours. 16th century Europe, like 21st century America, valued action, achievement, and measurable results. The idea that spiritual progress might come through receptivity rather than activity, through listening rather than speaking, through rest rather than effort, challenged the prevailing assumptions of Ignatius's world, just as it challenges ours. Yet Ignatius didn't reject action or effort. He founded one of the most active and influential religious orders in history, and the Jesuits have been known for centuries for their engagement in education, mission, and social justice. What he offered was not an either-or proposition, but a both and integration. Authentic spiritual life requires both active service and contemplative receptivity, both speaking and listening, both working and resting in God. The silence of sleep and prayer nourishes the activity of service, while that service creates the conditions and questions that we bring back to silence. This rhythm of action and contemplation becomes a defining characteristic of Ignatian spirituality. The phrase often used to describe this approach is contemplatives in action, people who maintain an awareness of God's presence and guidance even in the midst of busy, engaged lives. Ignatius believed that we could learn to carry something of that silent, listening heart into our active hours. maintaining a quiet center from which we can hear God speaking even amid the noise and demands of daily life. Of course, this isn't easy in a world that seems designed to eliminate every possible moment of silence. From the moment we wake to our final screen time before sleep, noise and stimulation surround us. Many of us have developed what amounts to a fear of silence, an instinctive reaching for distraction whenever a quiet moment arises. The thought of spending even a few minutes without input from music, podcasts, television, or social media can feel deeply uncomfortable. Ignatius would suggest that this discomfort itself might be significant. If we find ourselves consistently avoiding quiet, it may be worth examining why. What are we afraid might emerge in silence? What thoughts, feelings, or awareness have we been keeping at bay through constant noise and activity? Often, the very things we're most avoiding are precisely where God is waiting to meet us with healing and transformation. Our resistance to silence might be a clue to where our deepest spiritual work lies. The good news is that we don't have to dramatically restructure our lives to begin creating more space for silent listening. Small, consistent practices can begin to cultivate a greater capacity for silence and the spiritual receptivity that comes with it. Even 5 minutes of intentional quiet at the beginning or end of the day can begin to attune our spirits to the subtle voice of God. Turning off the radio during part of our commute, taking a short walk without earbuds, or simply pausing for a moment of silence before meals can create small islands of quiet in our noisy lives. Ignatius would particularly encourage us to attend to the transitions into and out of sleep as spiritually significant moments. Instead of scrolling through social media until we can't keep our eyes open, we might spend the last few minutes before sleep in quiet reflection, perhaps practicing a simple version of the exam. In the morning, rather than immediately reaching for our phones, we could take a moment to notice what feelings or insights are present upon waking, before the concerns of the day take over. These brief practices honor the natural silences that frame our days and create space for God's voice to be heard. For those who want to go deeper, the tradition of Ignatian spirituality offers rich resources for cultivating a listening heart. The full spiritual exercises, whether experienced in a 30-day retreat or adapted for daily life over several months, provide a comprehensive path for developing greater awareness of and responsiveness to God's communication. Shorter Ignatian retreats, spiritual direction in the Ignatian tradition, and prayer forms like Ignatian contemplation and the examen offer accessible entry points to the spirituality of listening. But even without these formal structures, the core insight remains available to all of us. God speaks in silence, and if we create more space for quiet in our lives, we create more opportunities to hear that divine voice. This isn't about adding complex new spiritual practices to already busy lives. It's about bringing greater awareness and intention to the natural rhythms and transitions that already exist in our days, especially the sacred thresholds of sleep and waking. Consider how different our spiritual lives might be if we approach them with this understanding. Instead of seeing prayer primarily as talking to God, presenting our needs and concerns, we might recognize it equally as creating space to listen. Instead of evaluating our spiritual progress by how much we accomplish or understand, we might value the quality of our receptivity and responsiveness to God's quiet guidance. Instead of seeing sleep as mere biological necessity that interrupts our real lives, we might honor it as a time of particular openness to God's work in us. This shift in perspective doesn't happen overnight. Like any relationship, our communion with God deepens gradually through consistent presence and attention. We learn to recognize God's voice in silence the same way we learn to recognize a loved one's voice in a crowded room, through familiarity born of regular, attentive connection. As we create more space for silence in our lives and pay attention to what emerges in that quiet, we gradually become more attuned to how God communicates with us personally. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ignatian spirituality is its emphasis on God's desire to communicate directly with each person. Ignatius firmly believed that the Creator wants to be in conversation with every creature, not just through general principles or intermediaries, but in a unique and personal way tailored to each individual. The God who knows us intimately, who has counted every hair on our heads, speaks to us in ways specifically designed to reach our particular hearts. This means that how God speaks to you in silence may be different from how God speaks to me or anyone else. For some, divine communication comes primarily through feelings of peace or disquiet that guide discernment. For others, it may arrive as mental images, memories, or insights that shed light on a situation. Some experience God's voice most clearly in nature, others in scripture or liturgy, still others in the quiet moments before sleep or upon waking. Ignatius invites us not to expect God's communication to follow some standardized pattern, but to pay attention to how God is actually speaking to us in our own experience. This personalized communication reflects the intimate nature of God's love. Just as a good parent knows how to communicate with each child in ways that child can best receive, our divine parent speaks to each of us in ways suited to our unique temperament, history, and needs. The silent heart becomes the meeting place for this deeply personal exchange, a sacred space where we are known and addressed by name. In my own life, I've found that some of the most significant spiritual insights have arrived not during formal prayer, but in those twilight moments between sleeping and waking. A question I've been wrestling with suddenly has a clear direction. A relationship that's been troubling me appears in a new light. A creative solution to a problem emerges fully formed. These aren't dramatic mystical experiences, but quiet clarities that have the ring of truth about them. They carry a sense of rightness and peace that my more anxious, effortful thinking rarely achieves. I've come to trust these quiet insights, not because they're spectacular or emotionally charged, but because they consistently lead toward greater love, freedom, and service. This is another key aspect of Ignatian discernment. Authentic divine communication, whether it comes in sleep, silence, or activity, ultimately orients us toward loving God and others more fully. It liberates us from fear, self-absorption, and attachments that diminish our capacity to love. It helps us become more fully the people God created us to be. When I've ignored these quiet guideposts, typically in favor of what seemed more logical or practical in purely human terms, I've often found myself regretting the choice later. Not because anything catastrophic happened, but because I missed an opportunity for growth or service that the quiet voice was inviting me toward. Over time, I've learned to take more seriously those gentle nudges that arrive in silence, to test them prayerfully rather than immediately dismissing them, and to look for the fruits they bear in my life and relationships. This learning to discern God's voice in silence is a lifelong process. It requires patience, humility, and consistent practice. We will sometimes mistake our own wishes or fears for divine guidance. We will miss God's voice at times because we're too distracted or preoccupied to hear it. But with practice, and the help of spiritual companions who can offer perspective on our discernment, we gradually become more adept at recognizing that quiet divine voice, amidst all the other voices competing for our attention. Ignatius offers several practical indicators to help us distinguish God's authentic communication from our own projections or from deceptive influences. Authentic divine guidance, he suggests, ultimately leads to greater faith, hope, and love. It increases our freedom to choose the good. It draws us towards service rather than self-absorption. It aligns with what we know of God's character as revealed in Scripture and tradition. And significantly, it tends to bring a sense of peace and rightness, even if what we're being asked to do is challenging. These indicators aren't meant as rigid formulas, but as helpful guideposts for discernment. They remind us that God's voice, while it may challenge us, doesn't typically lead to anxiety, confusion, or diminishment. Even when calling us to difficult choices, authentic divine guidance carries a sense of ultimate rightness and peace. This doesn't mean we won't experience fear or resistance, but beneath those natural human reactions, there's a deeper knowing that this path, however demanding, is aligned with our true purpose and good. The spiritual writer Ruth Haley Barton describes this quality of authentic guidance as a resonance with our truest self. It's as if something deep within us recognizes and responds to God's voice, even if our surface thoughts and feelings initially resist. This resonance often becomes most apparent in silence and solitude, when the noise of external voices and expectations subsides enough for us to hear our own deepest truth, which is always aligned with God's truth for us. I believe this is part of what Jesus meant when he said that his sheep know his voice. There's a quality to authentic divine communication that resonates with who we most truly are, because the God who created us knows us more deeply than we know ourselves. The silent heart becomes the place where this recognition happens, where our deepest self meets and responds to the God who has been speaking to us all along. All of this points to a profound truth about spiritual life. Our growth doesn't depend entirely, or even primarily, on our conscious efforts and understanding. Grace is always the primary actor, working in ways and times that transcend our awareness or control. When we recognize that God can speak to us even in sleep, we acknowledge the limitations of our own striving and open ourselves to the mysterious ways divine love works through every dimension of our humanity. This is deeply liberating. We don't have to figure everything out through sheer intellectual effort. We don't have to maintain perfect spiritual discipline or emotional equilibrium. We don't have to be spiritual experts or mystics to hear God speaking. We simply need to create some space for silence in our lives, to pay attention to the movements of our hearts, and to trust that God desires communication with us even more than we desire it ourselves. The life of Ignatius himself testifies to this truth. His most profound spiritual insights didn't come through academic study, though he eventually pursued that with great dedication. They didn't come primarily through his heroic ascetic practices, though discipline played a role in his formation. They came in moments of receptivity, often when he was most vulnerable. The foundations of his spiritual discernment arose not from theological arguments, but from careful attention to the interior movements of his own heart during that year of recovery and reflection. He learned to distinguish what he called consolation from desolation by noticing how different thoughts affected him, especially in the quiet of early morning or late evening. One of the most famous episodes in Ignatius's life illustrates this beautifully. While sitting beside the river Cardiner in Manresa, he had what he later described as a profound illumination, a moment of insight so significant that he said he learned more in that single experience than in all his studies that followed. He didn't describe this as an elaborate vision or ecstatic state, but as a clarification, a seeing into the nature of things that transformed his understanding. What's notable about this experience is that it happened not during intense spiritual practices, but in a moment of quiet receptivity beside a river. Ignatius had been engaging in prayer and reflection for months, creating conditions for this insight. But the illumination itself came as gift, not achievement. It arrived in a moment of openness, when he was simply present to the beauty of creation and the movements of his own heart. This pattern appears throughout the lives of the saints and spiritual masters. Their deepest insights and most transformative experiences often come not at the height of spiritual effort, but in moments of receptivity and surrender. Teresa of Avila spoke of recollection as a state of quiet attention to God's presence. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night, where God works most profoundly, when all our usual spiritual practices and experiences seem to fail us. The Desert Fathers and Mothers withdrew to silence not to escape the world, but to hear God more clearly. What all these spiritual guides share with Ignatius is a recognition that our relationship with God, like all genuine relationships, requires both speaking and listening, both activity and receptivity. The silent heart that Ignatius cultivated through his practices and experiences creates space for us to hear beyond our own thoughts and preconceptions, to receive guidance and love that we could never generate from our own resources. This understanding of silence as the context for divine communication has particular relevance for our contemporary world. We live in what's been called an attention economy, where countless forces compete for our focus and awareness. Social media, entertainment, advertising, news, and endless notifications create a constant barrage of stimulation that can make true silence seem almost impossible to find. Even our religious activities can become so filled with words and music and images that little space remains for quiet listening. In this context, Ignatius's emphasis on silence as the heart of spiritual communication offers a powerful countercultural witness. It reminds us that beneath all our activity and noise, God continues to speak in that still, small voice that can only be heard when we create space to listen. It encourages us to reclaim silence not as empty absence, but as pregnant presence, filled with potential for divine encounter. The practice of silent listening isn't just spiritually beneficial, it's also psychologically healing in our fragmented, distracted age. Research has shown that regular periods of silence and reflection improve mental health, reduce stress, enhance cognitive function, and increase empathy and relational capacity. What Ignatius discovered through spiritual experience aligns with what neuroscience now confirms. Our minds and souls need silence to function as they were designed to do. This convergence of spiritual wisdom and scientific insight invites us to take silence more seriously, not just as a luxury or an occasional spiritual practice, but as an essential dimension of healthy human life. When we create space for silence, we open ourselves to both divine communication and psychological integration. We allow the fragmented pieces of our experience to be gathered and made whole. We create conditions for the insights and clarity that often arise when our conscious mind releases its grip on a question or problem. So how do we begin to cultivate this silent heart in the midst of our noisy lives? Ignatius would suggest starting with small, consistent practices rather than dramatic gestures. Perhaps we can set aside 5 minutes in the morning or evening for silent prayer, gradually increasing the time as we grow more comfortable with quiet. We might practice the exam before sleep, reviewing our day in God's presence and releasing our concerns to divine care as we prepare for rest. We could create small technology fasts, periods where we deliberately set aside our devices to be more fully present to God and others. The transitions into and out of sleep remain particularly powerful opportunities for silent communion with God. As we drift toward sleep, we can gently offer any concerns or questions we're carrying to God's care, trusting that divine wisdom continues to work even as we rest. Upon waking, before the day's demands crowd in, we can notice what feelings or insights are present, paying attention to any clarity or direction that may have emerged during sleep. These simple practices don't require special training or elaborate preparation. They simply invite us to be more intentional about the natural silences and transitions in our days, to approach them as opportunities for communion rather than empty gaps to be filled. Over time, as we grow more comfortable with silence, we may find ourselves naturally seeking more of it, creating additional space for that quiet conversation with God that nourishes our souls. For those who want to go deeper, the tradition of Ignatian spirituality offers rich resources for developing a more contemplative dimension to life. Spiritual direction in the Ignatian tradition can provide guidance and accountability as we learn to discern God's voice in silence. Retreats, whether for a few hours, a weekend, or longer periods, offer extended opportunities to practice silent listening without the usual distractions of daily life. Prayer forms like Ignatian contemplation, centering prayer, and Lectio Divina provide structured approaches to creating space for God's voice to be heard. But even without these formal structures, the essential practice remains available to all, creating regular space for silence, paying attention to the movements of our hearts, and learning to distinguish God's authentic voice from the other voices that compete for our attention. This isn't about achieving some perfect spiritual state, but about growing in attentiveness to the God who has been speaking to us all along. The beautiful promise of Ignatian spirituality is that God desires communication with each of us more than we desire it ourselves. The divine voice has been speaking in our lives from the beginning, though we may not have recognized it. When we begin to create space for silence and to pay attention to how God might be communicating with us personally, we're not initiating a new conversation, but joining one that has already been in progress. This perspective transforms how we understand silence and listening in our spiritual lives. They're not just disciplines we practice to become better people or to earn divine favor. They're invitations to participate more consciously in the loving conversation God has been having with us from our first breath. The silent heart becomes not a spiritual achievement, but a homecoming, a return to the communion for which we were created. If these reflections on Saint Ignatius's teaching about silence and sleep have touched something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel where we explore together the path toward a deeper and more authentic faith. Each week we share teachings inspired by the lives of the saints to transform our spiritual life and draw closer to God. The wisdom of Saint Ignatius about hearing God in silence is just one treasure in the rich inheritance of our faith tradition. You are not alone in seeking a more contemplative approach to spirituality. Many of us are trying to create more sacred silence in our noisy world. Thank you for sharing this moment of reflection. Your presence here is already a sign of grace at work in your life. As we draw our time together to a close, I invite you to consider one simple practice to begin cultivating more silence in your own spiritual life. Tonight, before you fall asleep, take just 2 or 3 minutes to become still and aware of God's presence. You don't need to say anything or ask for anything. Simply rest in the awareness that you are loved and held in being by God. Then, when you wake tomorrow, before reaching for your phone or jumping into the day's activities, pause for another moment of silence, noticing what feelings, thoughts, or insights are present. This tiny practice, so simple it might seem insignificant, can become a doorway to greater awareness of how God speaks in your silent moments. Remember the words of Saint Ignatius himself, who discovered this truth through his own experience. It is not much knowledge that fills and satisfies the soul, but feeling and tasting things internally. The silent heart is where we most profoundly taste and feel God's presence. This is the place where intellectual knowledge is transformed into lived experience, where concepts about God become communion with God. In the quiet hours before dawn, in the gentle transition from sleep to waking, in the rare moments of stillness we manage to create in our hectic days, God continues to speak. The question is not whether God is speaking, but whether we are creating the silence necessary to hear. Saint Ignatius's enduring gift to us is the understanding that when we quiet the external and internal noise of our lives, even for brief moments, we open ourselves to a conversation more profound and transformative than anything our busy minds could generate on their own. There's a beautiful passage in the first book of Kings where the prophet Elijah, exhausted and discouraged, goes to the mountain to seek God's guidance. A powerful wind tears the mountain apart, but God is not in the wind. Then an earthquake comes, but God is not in the earthquake. Next comes fire, but God is not in the fire. Finally, there comes a still, small voice, or as some translations render it, the sound of sheer silence. And it is in this silence that Elijah encounters God and receives the guidance he needs. This biblical story aligns perfectly with Ignatius's understanding of how God typically speaks to us. The divine voice rarely comes in dramatic manifestations, but in that quiet whisper that can only be heard when we create space to listen. Like Elijah, we may need to pass through our own metaphorical winds, earthquakes, and fires, all the noise and drama and distraction of life, before we can hear that still, small voice that has been speaking all along. The silent heart is indeed where God speaks the loudest, whether in our waking contemplation or in the mysterious depths of sleep. May we all have the courage to enter more fully into these sacred silences, trusting that in them we will find not emptiness, but the fullest expression of divine presence. And may the God who speaks in silence continue to guide each of us, even as we sleep, toward the unique path of love and service we are called to walk in this world. As we cultivate this practice of sacred silence, we join a great communion of saints and seekers throughout the centuries who have discovered the same truth Ignatius articulated. From the desert fathers and mothers who withdrew to solitude to hear God more clearly, to the contemplative monastics who structured their entire lives around the rhythms of silence and speech, to ordinary people in every generation who have created small islands of quiet in busy lives, we participate in an ancient and ongoing conversation between humanity and divinity. The particular gift of Ignatian spirituality is its insistence that this conversation need not be reserved for spiritual elites or those who can withdraw from ordinary life. It is available to all who create even small spaces for silence and who pay attention to how God speaks in those quiet moments. This democratization of contemplative practice was radical in Ignatius's time and remains powerful today. In a world where we often feel we need special credentials or extensive training to participate fully in any domain, Ignatius reminds us that the essential spiritual practice of listening for God's voice requires no special status or expertise. It asks only our presence and attention, our willingness to create some space for silence and to notice what emerges there. This is spiritual practice at its most accessible and universal, available to anyone regardless of education, social position, or prior religious experience. At the same time, Ignatius recognized that we grow in our ability to discern God's voice through practice and guidance. The spiritual exercises themselves provide a structured path for developing greater spiritual sensitivity, and Ignatius encouraged his followers to seek regular spiritual direction as they learned to distinguish authentic divine communication from other influences. This balance between accessibility and depth characterizes Ignatian spirituality as a whole. The practice is simple enough for anyone to begin, yet rich enough to sustain a lifetime of growth and exploration. As we close our reflection on Saint Ignatius's teaching about the silent heart as the place where God speaks most clearly, I invite you to carry this awareness into your own life. Notice the quiet moments that already exist in your days. Pay attention to the transitions between sleep and waking, to those brief interludes when activity pauses, to the spaces between words in conversation or prayer. These natural silences are like doorways through which divine wisdom can enter, if only we are attentive enough to notice. In a world that increasingly fills every moment with noise and stimulation, the practice of sacred silence becomes not just spiritually significant, but culturally revolutionary. By creating space to hear beyond the cacophony of competing voices, we open ourselves to a deeper wisdom that can guide both our personal lives and our collective journey. We remember that beneath all our activity and achievement, we are fundamentally beings in communion, created for conversation with the divine and with one another. The silent heart that Ignatius cultivated through his spiritual practices and life experiences remains available to each of us today. It requires no special circumstances or elaborate techniques, only our willingness to create some space for quiet and our attention to what emerges there. In that silence, God continues to speak, often in ways too subtle for our noisy world to recognize, but powerful enough to transform our lives when we truly hear. May we all grow in our capacity to listen with the heart, to discern God's voice amidst the many voices that clamor for our attention, and to respond with love and generosity to what we hear. And may the God who speaks in silence, even as we sleep, continue to draw us into ever deeper communion with divine love and with all creation.